This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, Mr. Benn, without the beard, which he did have towards the end of his life. I spoke briefly at the Conway Hall event in May, which had a number of speakers, including Lindsay German, Kate Hudson, and Stan Newens, to name but three. Stan Newens was quite interesting about sort of toings and froings of the left in the Labour Party, and when Benn, was going to stand for leader or deputy leader, and what the discussions that went on, whether or not his memory was accurate is another matter, of course. But what I was doing there was taking issue with a number of the obituaries, in particular, I suppose, Brian Bravati's in The Guardian, which appeared fairly shortly after his death, obviously, which was very New Labourish, and trying to make some sense of very preliminary assessment of his historical impact and where his place in history might be. And of course, I suppose the point has been made by a number of people. I think Ben might have made it himself, that because of the diaries that he kept, and he kept more than one diary, it appears, according to Jad Adams, as one of his biographers, and numerous other papers, I believe, kept in the basement at Holland Park. And it's a question of what's going to happen to those, which I think is something that we probably want to follow up ourselves. It's been very quiet as to what's actually going to happen to the papers that haven't been published, which are voluminous, I think, by any account. And might well be quite interesting for reasons I'll come on to. So the point, the traditional account was and will be was produced a while before Tony Benn's death by Vernon Bogdana on the Westminster Hour on Radio 4, is that Benn made an impact on history because of the Act of Parliament that he inspired to allow people to announce their peerage and become an MP in 1963, because of the impact that he had in terms of the introduction of the referendum as a device into the British Constitution. He was probably the key person who persuaded Harold Wilson to have a referendum on Europe, although in the process of persuading, he'd moved from being pro to anti-Europe in the 1970s. And the third point that Bogdana made, Tony Benn?
Yes.
The third point that Bogdana made was that his campaign to democratise the Labour Party in terms of the election of the leader and deputy leader had a significant impact well beyond the Labour Party, and both the Liberal Democrats, who are probably always slightly inclined to that, but certainly the Conservative Party also now had some mechanism to allow members to have a say in the election of the leadership. So that's the kind of official view, I think, of Tony Benn's impact on British history. I don't think it's the kind of view that the left would want to have, although it's a perfectly valid view. I think one could argue about it in that sense. There's no question that Benn did do those things, and they did have an impact. But I don't think, if you just say to people, Tony Benn, what was he trying to achieve? They say, well, what he was really after was a referendum in the British Constitution. Well, no, it wasn't, was it? They would say he was trying to achieve socialist change. And of course, the official view here, and it's really writ large in that Bravati obituary published in The Guardian earlier this year, is that Benn was a leader of, if not the left, sort of radical Labour in Parliament, and then at some point he chose to pick up extra parliamentary activity and lost his influence, never became Labour leader, which many people apparently thought he would do after Harold Wilson, and his influence declined. I think that's the kind of view we might want to argue with, and I'm sure it's a view that Benn himself would argue against. So Benn, as I said, secured his own place in history by the diaries, which remain an invaluable resource. But I don't think they are. So for historians, it's very interesting to look back, see what ideas Benn, events Tony Benn decided to comment on in his diary, and which ones he didn't, and how he commented, and that was quite interesting. But for the historian, that's not really going to be sufficient to understand Benn's place in history or his historical impact. We want to go much further. And once you start to look into it, as I have been doing after I spoke at Conway Hall on the specific issue of how the obituaries have gone, you notice a few kind of issues which are quite striking, really. One of the main ones is that, and perhaps it's a little early, but most substantial figures in recent British political history have at least one significant biography written about them. That is not usually unfriendly, particularly, but certainly mentions and covers bits and pieces in the politician's life that perhaps, if they were going to write it themselves, they might not have mentioned. So, you look at there's one on Roy Jenkins quite recently, which covers his numerous affairs and so on. Harold Wilson had several. Blair is still around, and there's things much to be dug up there, no doubt. But when you look at Benn, these don't exist. I don't know whether it's because of the diaries. People just felt, well, what are we going to say? But it's quite interesting when you think about it, because if it's not in the diaries, it might well be in the other papers that we haven't seen. There are all kinds of questions and gaps, and there's nothing much to cover it. So the two biographies that exist, one is by David Powell, which was published as he stood down as an MP, which I think is more just a kind of authorised political biography. That's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. It's quite brief, and it's kind of bigged up on Tony Benn's website, so it gives you some idea. The other is a more substantial book by Jad Adams that was published again more or less just after the period when Benn stood down as an MP in 2001, but it was revised with a couple of chapters in 2010. And so Jad Adams is more interesting. He's obviously picked up through radio, I guess these days, internet search engines, kinds of quite entertaining quotes that Tony Benn made in various news publications and speeches that are not covered in his diaries. But when you think about it, there are kind of quite big gaps which we just don't know much about. So, for example, I'll just take a couple of examples, I'm not going to go on for too long. Take two examples. Benn was widely regarded as being Harold Wilson's protege in the early 1960s, and certainly wrote substantial portions of his speeches around the period of the 1964 election. By 10 years later, Benn and Wilson had fallen out quite significantly. But we don't know much about what actually happened there, why that happened, although you can obviously surmise. But there's very little, obviously there's bits and pieces in Tony Benn's diary and so on, but there's very little to provide an account of what was going on there with those two figures. Another area which perhaps is more pertinent to the kind of people that might often attend this seminar and what to know, is Benn's relationship with the the left outside of the Labour Party, or the extra parliamentary left. Benn spoke at rallies, I think primarily of what was the Socialist Party, but the militant when it was in the Labour Party. There were pictures of him doing this, he comments on it occasionally in his diaries. Later he spoke, in particular at the marches and events organised by the Socialist Workers' Party every year in this area. But we've no idea really, beyond the fact clearly that he was a lifelong Labour Party man, we've no idea what he kind of said, what the relationships were between Benn and the left, at least not as far as I'm aware. There's certainly very little documentation about this. We do, I suppose, and again, this is kind of more surmised than anything. The group around Labour Briefing, who I think was one of the groups responsible for the Benn for deputy campaign in the early 1980s, certainly had some, I think, orthodox Trotskyists of various kinds in it. Whether Benn fully realised that or what his view was, again, it's not clear that we really know that. And I think these are the kind of things that are quite interesting in the wider historical scale, because if you're looking at somebody that's been such a significant figure in the history of the main Social Democratic Party, yet somebody that's also clearly got some kind of relationship with other political groupings, understanding a bit more about what their relationship actually was, in order to make some kind of historical assessment of him, is quite interesting. What I also did when I was researching this was to have a look at how, and again it's kind of quite easy to forget this, depending on how old you are, because in that period, certainly after he retired as an MP, Benn became almost like a sort of a national treasure, a lovable old man who'd been around a long time, and all right, things he was making weren't quite orthodox, but a lot of the things that he said somehow, because he'd been around for such a long time, had actually happened and proved to be, not totally wrong, occasionally even absolutely right. So he had that kind of view, but of course that wasn't the view that people, the media, and many people had of Benn in the 1970s and 1980s. But if you look back to the way that the media treated Benn at that period, I mean, it was extremely vitriolic. Dominic Sandbrook's book Seasons in the Sun, which covers the 1970s, details this in some depth. Sandbrook, I think, is no great friend of Benn, but he's quite an interesting, primarily a cultural historian. But just look through that, which you can do digitally these days, so you don't need to waste your time rereading Sandbrook's views on various pop records of the day. At one point, Benn was tipped off by the Sunday Mirror that the media had stories that he was involved in sex and drugs evenings in some building in Marylebone, which was even knew Benn slightly, was kind of absurd. I mean, as a sort of lifelong pipe smoker and tea drinker, this was far-fetched. Anyway, I don't think this story ever made it into print. I think that's for that obvious reason. But the feeling that, and this was, you saw this in Chris Mullen's Very British Coup. I think that feeling that they weren't far away from either some kind of British military intervention into the affairs of government, as it happened in Australia with Gough, or CIA destabilising, whatever it was. It all seems a bit kind of, well, come on, they weren't really doing this, were they? Or they wasn't serious. Well, we can have a view on that. But at the time, of course, it seemed very real, and that, I think, really shaped a lot of Benn's politics as somebody that, had and was in a very senior position, but was moving to the left. So, what are we doing for time? I'll just put another 5 minutes, just a few other points. In terms of his politics, I mean, it's quite interesting. I did say this when I spoke at Conway Hall, but I'm afraid, as I was pointing out to somebody that seemed a bit affronted that I'd used the same quote twice in a couple of different articles, but in fact the reason was because the quote was actually an existing quote, and I'm afraid it wasn't going to change just because time had moved on. It was still the most relevant quote. So I'm afraid that it remains the case, as it was in May, that Benn read the Communist Manifesto for the first time according to his diaries on the 25th of December 1976, which is quite late in his career. And he wrote the day after, when he was 51, in the years up to 1968 I was just a career politician. Up to 1973 I shifted to the left. And there is that kind of angle of the leftward moving Benn, the person that becomes eventually the president of the Stop the War Coalition in the last period, very much associated with left-wing causes. This wasn't the Benn of the 1950s and 1960s, although, as people have pointed out, he did have left-wing, radical kind of politics to some extent at that stage. He was involved in the movement for colonial freedom. He was against nuclear testing, although not a member of C&D, as Kate Hudson pointed out at Conway Hall at that period. When it was formed in the late 1950s, he didn't become a member at that stage. So there were some radical elements to his politics, but he moved very much to the left. What I think an historian would have to say, and I don't think there's any getting away from this, I think, understandably, it doesn't kind of get said in the period immediately after his death. Somebody that was in high ministerial office for the length of time that Benn was, inevitably did things, whether we fully agree with them or not, that don't look marvellous from a left-wing point of view. So he was the person responsible, and he says it in his diary, for bringing in the military armed police into the nuclear industry, which by any stretch of the imagination is hardly a progressive activity. One might think it was not totally improvement in some senses. He was also responsible when he was energy minister for a lot of the pit closures, which led to it was one of the motors for the miners' strike in 1984-5, which he recognised, I think. But if you look at Jad Adams has some kind of interesting quotes on this, which go back to the late 60s. And you think, well, this is before the period when he was doing it. And there he's making a defence of the mining industry, saying, that actually if you shut mines, you're taking away people's livelihoods, and this is a permanent kind of thing, and this is a very bad kind of idea. And this is what's important. There's a sort of technology that, of course, he was well known for. Clearly he was obsessed by gadgets in his earlier life, not I think so much in his later life. It wasn't that significant compared to the jobs and that were being lost by the development of technology. So I suppose in a sense you perhaps were saying there no more than that he had personal views and stuff that he did in his official capacity, which is hardly any great surprise. But it goes back in a sense to this kind of lack of any authoritative biography, because that's the kind of thing you'd expect to kind of come out in that kind of framework where somebody would be called that as a minister he'd done this, but by the way I find in his correspondence that he said, well, it's just not there. So it's quite difficult to kind of draw an assessment at this stage of that kind of thing. Well, I'll wind up now because I think there's no point. We don't want to bang on too much at this point. It was just to make sure that we marked a preliminary kind of assessment of Benn in the context of the Institute of Historical Research, and to allow people to make any points they want to, obviously. But I do think, as I was saying, I think before we started, that the diaries are published, they're out there, but there's a lot more material held, both in terms of correspondence, papers, other bits and pieces of diaries which are not in the public domain. I'm not too sure what exactly the plans are for those. I've certainly seen nothing, but I think there's quite a good case, in fact a very good case to be made for trying to do something along the lines of the Thatcher Foundation. Whatever we may think about Mrs Thatcher, and slightly oddly perhaps, since she never seemed to be the person that was that bothered about history, the Thatcher Foundation has been assiduously putting online all the bits and pieces of Thatcher period, which you can set the body in, but it's going online and you can access it, have a look at speeches, comments, all kinds of stuff, which is, you know, sometimes not always of great interest, sometimes quite interesting. But in terms of Benn, I think there is so much there that would be of value, certainly to historians, and that's obviously what concerns us centrally here, but perhaps also to people just generally to have a look. Certainly, you know, when I'm writing a piece, as I do sometimes, say for the Morning Star about some anniversary, I would often go back to Benn's diary to see if he'd said anything about it, and if so, what he'd said. Now, obviously, you know, it's not a definitive view, but it kind of gives you an interesting little feel for what somebody like Benn was thinking about in terms of, you know, on occasion, what he wasn't thinking about, which is even more annoying when you can't find any reference to something that you think, well, surely he has something to say on that. So that's the kind of thing. The final point I would make is, again, I was saying before, that he spoke at a conference organised here by the Socialist History Seminar. Unfortunately, I can't remember which one it was. I thought it was the vote, which would have been the kind of obvious one. But having checked that, it wasn't. It was an earlier one, and it was sometime not long after I think his wife Caroline had died. And he turned up here on a Saturday morning in a taxi, which was kind of quite odd because most speakers would come here on foot or by bus or tube. I suppose you can understand that he probably didn't travel by public transport too much because of the, you know, constantly being pestered by people. But it was having kind of booked him. I mean, I had a kind of strong memory of this, and it's the kind of thing that obsesses organisers of events. I sort of booked him, and I think he must have written back at that stage, this is before, saying, yeah, I'll be along. And then I couldn't get hold of him, sort of rang him, well, you know, to make sure you were coming. Nothing. I don't know what you can do about it. Either he turns up or he doesn't turn up. But he did. He turned up, spoke, you know, I think from memory quite well, and then off again in another taxi, I think from memory. And then he used to ring me up occasionally and talk about various papers that he thought were worth keeping in archives, which sometimes we could do something about. But that kind of fits into the, in labour movement history, it kind of fits into the kind of gentleman leader kind of category. And I think there is something about Benn that fits into that. And going back to, in some ways, and I'll just qualify it separately, Henry Hunt, Fergus O'Connor, I mean, there are Hinman to some extent. It needs to be qualified because all of those people, of course, though they were charismatic, radical leaders with some finance, their finances were notoriously dodgy in every case. I don't think that was true of Mr. Benn, either because his finances were so large, so it wasn't necessary, or perhaps more likely because he was just more prudently behaved than they were. But there is something, I think, of that kind of feel about Tony Benn. I'm not convinced that's the kind. You know, it's a kind of convenient category you can slot people into. I think that's kind of quite lazy history. So I wouldn't be convinced that that's the kind of ideal place to put him. But it's a kind of thought as a framework, and it just goes back to the point which I'll finish on, that that would be really quite helpful. I think we'll try and do something about this when a moment comes to say that, you know, we really think it would be a good idea to get more stuff out there and online from his papers. But also to see whether or not anybody's up to actually writing a weighty tome or a volume or two of biography, which might give us a better kind of framework around which to work, which, as I say, at the minute really doesn't exist. Joe Adams' book is fine, but it's not the kind of volume that is about to ask any good questions, even in a friendly way, which you can do. So, that's it for me. And if anybody wishes to pitch in with their own thoughts about Tony Benn, or tell me that I've just been speaking a load of rubbish for the last half an hour, then you're quite welcome to do so.
This meeting was supposed to start at 5:05.
Correct. It started about 25 to.
Sir?
Started about 25 to, so.
Yeah, well, I did.
You only missed a few preliminary.
I wanted to make sure I was the lights.
Did you want to say something?
Yes.
Go on then.
I thought Tony Benn was a rather odd member of a rather odd political party. Good and rather around the world. And unlike other, if you look at the Conservatives, their main object in life is to win elections. The whole point being operating as a political party is to win elections. Exactly what we're doing at the moment. With Tony Benn, it wasn't that at all. That being in power was a corrupting influence on us. And he would always go, if you heard Tony Benn speak, it would be a history lesson. He would go back, sometimes to William the Conqueror. But the theme of all his obsession was every labouring leader from Ramsay and John onwards betrayed the party and the working class.
Mm.
Even Clemently, Melville, and he had Jim Callahan, and he had a special loading Tony Blair. It's ironic, in Conservative Party, there was widespread admiration for Tony Blair for winning 3 elections. For the Labour Party, but for Tony Benn, he was the great traitor who betrayed the Labour movement. And he seemed to be stuck in this time capsule. I don't know if Tony Benn or somebody else who said it again. He once said something like, we've got to go back to the policies we had when Keir Hardie was leader. This was in his entire thinking. There was a wonderful golden age for Labour before it was betrayed in 1931 by its own leader. And if only we could, like, and also there were no enemies on the left. And he didn't seem to criticise the Tories very much. It was always Labour's own people. Jim Callahan, he was way into these people. But never the Conservatives. The enemies were within, as far as he was concerned, within the Labour Party itself.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Again, I suppose in a sense, you can look through his diaries digitally now, so you can prove that. We could do it now, but I won't. Find out how many times he does mention Tories in his diaries and what he says about them. But it's part of the times, isn't it? Because he's involved all the time, really from when he becomes an MP again in '63, certainly through to 20 years until he loses the deputy leadership election to Healy, as being somebody that's kind of positioning himself, isn't he, to become perhaps a Labour Prime Minister, or to to have a significant influence in the party. So I suppose you could say that, well, that explains why his obsessions were much as they were. There was a couple of books of his speeches. One of them was his Morning Star columns that I wrote those, but in the 1990s, I think. And then there's Arguments for Socialism, which I think dates back to the 70s. These are nearly all kind of, in a sense, it tells you something about what the kind of person Benn was. But he's a diarist, he's a speaker, and he's somebody that writes journalism. He's not somebody that's going to write an academic article. He's not somebody that's going to write a theoretical book in a way, for example, that I suppose you could argue Tony Boston did. He's very much the politician, and as I kind of mentioned, he was the kind of spin doctor of Harold Wilson in 63-4. But there's a lot of those pieces that I had a look through when I was preparing for this do have a go at, if not the Tories, they have a go at sort of what you might call capitalism generally, something like that's going on that the capitalists are doing.
It sounds like that you've never had any clear idea of the specific things that Benn wants to see happen. Maybe it was leaving it closed on American basis.
Yeah.
Whereas Mrs. Thatcher, she gave a shopping list of all the things she was going to do.
Well, so again, and this is perhaps covered better in Sandbrook's book. He wouldn't be there. There are others, but Sandbrook's kind of one of the reasons he said he's entertaining. That period after the February and October 1974 elections, Labour won, of course, but quite narrowly. Benn was a minister, and so that 1974-79 period, at that point he lays out, and this is the point that Sandbrook makes, and it's a bit, in fact you could argue a bit overstated, it's the battle between the Thatcherite view of where Britain should be going and the Bennite view, and Thatcher of course wins out in 79. But the Benn view, some of which was actually carried into practice by the Wilson-Callaghan government, was around the National Enterprise Board Bank, I remember both of them, I think, cooperatives like Meriden Motorcycles. It was about economic planning and more state intervention. That was.
The first of those enterprises collapsed, didn't they?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying they worked, but that was his. We could argue about whether or not it was actually a kind of policy that was going to. Stuart Holland, I think, who was the MP for Vauxhall, wasn't he, at one point, and then just got disillusioned and I think he's still alive, actually. He went to Italy, didn't he? He left Britain anyway, I think. Anyway, Stuart Holland, I think, was probably the mover behind a lot of this kind of stuff. I think he must have been Benn's advisor or something, I guess. Yes, I mean, you could. So the Thatcherite vision is the one that got the popular vote, and the Benn one didn't. Was the point that Sam would make. Benn was here, I'm sure he would say, well, that's all very well, but my views still remain something that needs to be kind of considered when you look at 2008 and what happened as a result of the Thatcher period. So, but the backdrop to that, and again, this is covered very well. There's going to be a lot by Sam, of course, is you've got the massive economic crisis after the oil, after the after the Six-Day War, 1973. The economy's on the uppers. The IMF comes in 76.
With the Yom Kippur.
Yeah. So it's quite difficult in that sense.
What was of his attitude towards democracy was a bit ambivalent?
A big?
Bit ambivalent, but for example, the referendum, 75%, 75, was it?
75.
Well, we voted 70-30 to remain in common market as it then was.
Yeah.
Would have decided the issue as far as Benn was concerned.
Yeah.
For decades. Shortly after, who was the man who used to work at Habitat with Harold Wilson and Jim Callahan, wrote diaries?
Pains.
Anyway, so
Crossland. Crossman.
What he was saying, Tony Benn was a person who could drop a piano on him, and he bounced back like a tennis ball. He was uncrushable in that respect. But he wanted the manifesto, to say that Britain would leave the common market, even though 5 years previously we had a referendum to. So I always thought he was a bit ambivalent as far as.
Presumably his argument would have been that had Labour won in 1983, that would have represented an endorsement for that position, which obviously in practice Labour didn't do very well, whether it was to do with that particular policy commenting.
Probably not.
He would have presumably said that the people would have expressed their will in parliamentary election.
But I think the bouncing back thing is interesting in a way, because I think there is that element there. And that, I think, goes back to the point I was trying to make about the gentleman leader. It's about the patrician leader, who, in a sense, because of their background. So, again, I don't know exactly what Benn's financial position was, but I don't think there was any question that he was, hard upward. I think he was, sufficiently well off to pursue a political career. His late wife, Caroline, was also, I think, quite well off from family money. He was the kind of person that didn't need to feel that, blimey, if I'm not elected as an MP, as he wasn't, of course, in Bristol eventually, or that I'm going to have to go away and do something else. So he's the kind of person that feels that they've got the freedom to pursue, their ideas without feeling that, if I get knocked back here, then I have to take that as being a sort of, that'll be it for the time.
It took it to extremes a little bit, this being thrifty. He used to have his bottles, thermos flask and sandwiches on all the time. Allegedly.
He was certainly a tea. Well, I mean, I never sampled the tea that he drank, but those that did said it was disgusting and sort of weak and, But
was that just for show, you think?
No, I don't think it was. No, I mean, of course, that was the case. You've been pondering this about Farage. I mean, given the fact he leaks all over the place, we'll probably find out when the Farage's apparent love for rather bland cask beer, real ale, is actually just something that he does when the pictures are there, whether he does actually knock it back. I kind of had the feeling that Farage is actually a wine man on the quiet.
Certainly when he had his lunch with Greeno in Brussels, he was
from Arden wine.
I do get that kind of review. But Howard Wilson, of course, famously, and get this, he was the first image man. Ben was responsible for this in some degree. I mean, again, the point I was making earlier, we don't really know quite how responsible he was for it. But Ben had this kind of image of the pipe, and famously tried by Win Carnis. I did tonic. Disgusting drink that I'm not even sure if it's still about. That was Wilson in public. In private, of course, Wilson drank brandy and smoked a cigar, being an Oxford Don, whatever. So, but I don't think Ben was like that. I think Ben genuinely was. And again, it's the gentleman leader stuff. If you go back to somebody like Fergus O'Connor used to appear when he spoke at large meetings in a fustian cotton jacket, okay, which wasn't his normal wear. Because I'm a man of the people. I'm wearing the same kind of clothing that the people I'm speaking to here are wearing. It's all about the image that I'm putting across. I don't think Ben was. I don't know why he was. Again, it's difficult to say. I mean, the kind of thought comes to mind. It wouldn't be the kind of my kind of background to be able to say, really, and that's where this thing about biography will be so interesting. He was a Methodist, and there's an element in Methodism that has that kind of, and it may have been that.
He always looks as if he was ready for anything, whether it's to have to stay up or out all night in case the train went on strike. Therefore, he had his jacket on his bed.
There's a thing in these.
Go to the Antarctic.
Where was it? something in his diary where I think it was in somewhere. This was in the 60s. For whatever reason, he'd been out and doing a meeting of Mr. Train or something. So he had to wait in the waiting room that existed until the first train in the morning. Apparently, he pulled out of his bag some blow-up airbed. Put it down on the wooden seat off to sleep. It's kind of slightly eccentric behaviour, one might say, but he may not have seen it in that way. I think that's still part of the kind of background, because he did come from quite a well connected, and that was that in a sense. And again, I can't get on to what we're on about. This is the kind of thing that a biography might have a bit more to say about. You can kind of understand some of the feelings that came out about him, because he was a man of the political establishment.
Did he cut his own hair?
I don't know, I doubt it. When he went to events at the American Embassy or something like this, you can read this in his diaries and so on. All the well-known, well-connected people, they know him, he knows them, he knows their fathers, and he's very much a political establishment.
He knocked power, stuff like that. He used to know.
His wife was a member of the wealthy American family.
Yes, I believe so.
She was a member of the American establishment.
Yes, absolutely, yes. So, I think the fact that he then sort of said, okay, clearly on course potentially to become Prime Minister, I think that was the expectation. And then suddenly, not suddenly perhaps, but over a relatively brief period of time, I'm going away from that. Creates kind of waves of uncertainty, I think, about that's the kind of understands, perhaps explain some of the reception that he got.
What did he look for out of?
Well, we were discussing that in a sense. I think you can see that in some of his the speeches that are published. But as you say, the kind of stuff he tended to see was harking back to the traditional Labour movement views. So we would talk about the Chartists for democracy, suffragettes and so on. So there's all that kind of, democratic society, equal society, all the kind of traditional things that you would find associated with the Labour movement. But then in the 70s he had this kind of thing around more state control of industry, around the National Enterprise Board, banking and so on, workers' cooperatives, shifting the balance. If you were to look at what that really means, and this goes on in all the time, it's going on at the minute, is where's the balance between the private and the public sector? Sometimes the public sector has got more, sometimes the private sector has got more. So he's very much in favour of shifting the balance of the economy over to the public sector, and getting rid of the private sector, but a smaller private sector. Obviously Mrs Thatcher's view was way back over the other way, much smaller public sector, much bigger private sector. The current government obviously is in the same kind of area. Miliband officially is meant to be a little bit back over to the public sector side. We'll see if he manages to get into number 10. So it's in that kind of equation. But you see, saying that is the kind of interesting. I was talking a bit earlier before you came in about Benn's relationship with the far left or extra-parliamentary left and so on, which he certainly had. None of that really fits that kind of perspective. And he was kind of aware of those views, but we don't really know, whether he just thought, well, that's not really practical. I don't know. We don't know.
Well, of course, I wasn't famously sadly immature with age. You mentioned Hal Wilson's pipe.
Yeah.
Which did Ben suggest you should? Because
I don't know.
In those days, somebody smoking a pipe was supposed to give you a rather reassuring, homely image. Could you imagine today Ed Miliband or Cameron smoking a pipe? They'd be treated with derision, wouldn't they?
They would, but it's gone out of fashion. But the interesting thing, it's not perhaps centrally relevant to what we're doing. I went in Huddersfield a few weeks ago. I was visiting a pub. But Huddersfield's changed quite a bit as a town now. Its main industries are brewing and the university. It's just the proposal is building a massive new brewery with Magic Rock in the centre of the town, which is actually a marvellous brewery. But the statue of Harold Wilson is out the front of the railway station, of course, still. And I thought that's interesting. I'll have a look at that. I've got a picture on my phone. There's two interesting things about it. First of all, there is no pipe. Okay, that's odd. Because surely any statue of Harold Wilson should have a pipe. No pipe.
Can it jacket?
Yeah, no, that's all there. Well, the other interesting thing about it, in a sense, is that if you go around, there's a statue, for example, of Nye Bevan in Queen Street in Cardiff, the main shopping street, which is kind of, you know, it's cleaned up sometimes, but quite often sort of pigeon droppings on it. Sometimes there's a traffic cone stuck on the top or whatever. But this statue were no pigeon droppings, there was no graffiti. And if you hang around for a few minutes, you can see people actually going, oh, that's interesting. So, okay. It's really quite interesting. But the pipe thing is, yeah, that's right, you wouldn't expect to see that. I'm not quite sure what you would expect to see.
Well, you wouldn't go on television to be interviewed,
pipe. Again, I don't know whether Benn, who was responsible for doing that. I mean, you would surmise that because Benn was the image man, he might have been, but I don't actually know if that's the case. And it's not clear. There might, again, this is the point I'm making about the papers, there might be something in those papers down in the basement at Holland Park, whether they're still there, they've moved, I don't know, to where he lived, where this is recorded. It might be a sort of, correspondence between Wilson and Benn saying, I think Harold Pipe would be just the thing for the image on television. I don't know.
To what extent are the diaries edited? I mean, is it a published one, so is it selection rather than the full?
They are edited by Ruth Winstone, who's still about, and just publishing a massive new volume of extracts from all kinds of political diaries. But there's one compendium volume which runs from 1940 to 1990. That is quite heavily edited, but quite kind of handy if you just want to flick through or look digitally. But the individual diaries, I think there's 6 volumes, are still edited, but there's a lot more stuff in the individual volumes than there is in the compendium. So, but that's not the only diary, and Joe Adams makes this clear. He had a kind of events or diary where he noted, meetings he was going to, events that were coming up. But he also kept, aside from the diary where he recorded his impressions of what had gone on a particular day, he had a political diary which is not published. And what's in that? No idea. So there's a lot of stuff there that's still not to be hasn't yet reached the public domain.
Can you speak languages? I remember when he was awful Concord, I think it was French, English, Concord.
Yeah,
funding.
about as well as David Cameron does. Not as far as I know. Do you know?
No,
I
I
don't
don't know
know.
anything, but I don't
I
think.
wonder if he could do the French part.
I never heard him.
Like Heath, for instance.
With his expensive education, you would think he could do, but I suppose going back. Yes.
I heard somebody say he had no interest in anything outside politics. But something like Dennis Heaney, for example, was interested in music, theatre, reading, books,
I think that's right.
fiction, and Graham had no interest at all in this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's substantially true. And again, that's kind of quite. I'm just thinking back to that framework I was positing about gentlemen leaders. Him was interested in cricket. He played first-class cricket.
Did he?
Yes, he did, absolutely. Played for the MCC in the 1860s. Fergus O'Connor. Now, Henry Hunt was interested in making money out of... yeah, I think that's actually quite unusual. You see, again, I come back to this point. This is where the kind of biography, a substantial biography would reach. Because again, a biographer might ask, here's Benn. He's a substantial figure of the political establishment, quite a well-off individual, well-educated, comes up, becomes a political figure in the 1950s. Let's look at a few other figures briefly in that kind of mould. Clearly were some. Some of them might have been in the Tory party, perhaps more typically than Labour, but were they singular political figures without a great deal of obvious outside interests, or were they not? And then that gives us a better way of judging whether or not Benn is kind of unusual, or whether we're saying he's part of a cohort of people that come up perhaps after the Second World War who've got a view about how they want to see society develop.
Of course, Benn and Mrs. Thatcher were born in the same year.
Yeah.
But Mrs. Thatcher had absolutely no interest outside politics, art or
No, Dennis did.
theatre,
Golf.
anything like that.
And gin.
Reading books and
Yeah, again, I mean, that's quite an interesting point. I mean, if you look at Benn's diaries, and again, point that Tommy makes there, we don't know quite how much has been left out, but you don't get in the 70s. I got the latest Clash LP. I thought that was quite good. Or I wasn't sure that was what I like. Or Led Zeppelin, they're not bad. The kind of thing that an ordinary person kind of, Benn was, as I say, in his late, it was about the right kind of age to do that probably. There's nothing about that, nothing about fiction. It's
He was tenacious about keeping up with new media, wasn't he? Pages as soon as they came.
He was,
out,
yeah, absolutely.
Computers as soon as they
He
came.
was, yeah.
Tweeting.
There's loads of entertaining stuff in his diaries about photocopiers and recording machines and answering machines and he was a gadgets kind of.
Well, I suppose as Minister of Technology, he ought to
He saw it.
to be highly aware.
He presumably invented the whitey to the technological revolution.
He did.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're not necessarily quite.
That was Wilson.
Yeah, but he wrote the speech, but not quite those words, I think, but very similar words. It was part of his view. Again, if you look in the diaries, you'll see he's got this kind of view of technology as being progress, which is a kind of view of
Pioneering.
Stalinist Marxism in a very shorthand kind of sense, which was the predominant view. We're making progress. We launched a rocket that's gone somewhere or another. 5-year plan. It's very much that kind of view of, scientific progress is about the progress of mankind. This is what socialism. That's kind of there in Benn, and that's a kind of offshoot. That at some point, I think he loses that view very largely and moves over to the idea, well, the better one actually, that it's people that change the world, not machines. So that in itself is kind of an interesting kind of perspective as to quite how how that change occurs. But
presumably after 79, because as Minister of Energy, he was still supporting nuclear power.
Yeah, absolutely, he was. Yeah, and it's interesting how. Sean Crichton, who's comes here occasionally, who's quite a well-known Labour historian. I bumped into him in Wimbledon a few weeks back when I was attending a union, some exciting union executive meeting. And he said, "Oh well, I can't come today." No, it's not. But I've got this really strong memory of Benn. I was at a meeting, in the early 1970s, when Benn had been the minister. which wasn't at that stage because he was not in office, and he attended some kind of leftish, very left-wing meeting to speak about his view of the future, and he got a lot of flack because of, you know, the kind of background that he'd had as a minister in the Wilson government up to 1970. But then Sean said, well, actually, this is Benn, you know, by the end of the meeting, they were all sort of eating out of his hand because he had that kind of charismatic kind of thing, and he'd be able to persuade them that, yeah, well, that was, yeah. But it is kind of odd how you don't, again, I mentioned this when I was talking, the kind of stuff that he did around energy with the coal industry, the kind of stuff he did with nuclear power, neither of which is, you know, exactly popular with, wasn't at the time popular with the left. It just doesn't register on the...
On a personal front, what did he spend his money on?
Tea bags. Yeah, quite a nice house in Holland Park. But that must have probably had that for years. And the sort of the family seat at Stansgate, which I don't think was anything much. I really don't know, to be honest. He appeared to have, he said, a kind of frugal kind of, no obvious...
Well, assuming his will has not been, the state has not been proved yet.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. No, so we may see details of how much he left. We'd be front page on the Daily Telegraph. Socialist Benn left millions, proof. He was... But, yeah.
I look forward to that one.
Yeah.
But of course, there were always stories, whether they were true or not, but there were family trusts.
Yeah.
Which would mean that you could take steps to mitigate inheritance tax. So one just doesn't know.
No, it would be surprising if there weren't, to be honest, wouldn't it? It's the way of the world.
He's not going to leave it to the nation to use.
That's as far as I know.
He's not. Sorry.
But it would be nice if he left his papers to the nation in some way. I think there was some discussion with the British Library about whether he was going to leave his papers there. I might just have a look and see if that's a chat with one or two of the people there to see whether or not that's the case. Because if that is the case, that would be rather helpful. Because I just think that at the minute, it's one of the reasons for doing this was just to try and kick off some wider discussions about why. What we know about Tony Benn and what we don't know, and in terms of trying to think about what the historical impact was going to be. It's far too early to draw any conclusions, but we're moving just now beyond the immediate period of his death, where we've got the obituaries, and starting to think about how is he going to be remembered, and what are we going to have to remember him by. Anyway, any more quick points before we...
Just one quick one.
Yeah, go on.
You said that towards the end of his life he was considered to be a national treasure. Well, tell me up to a point, because I think I noticed when after he died, Neil Kelly, Will Hamston,
Yeah.
and Dennis Healy made some very hostile comments.
Yeah.
And they all said Tony Benn caused immense damage to the Labour Party by standing up, challenging leadership, for the challenge for the clinic at one stage, and going for the deputy leadership.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Well, Healy, I think, was slightly more reconciled to Benn eventually, but the points they were making was, of course, that if Benn had actually managed to succeed in becoming leader of the Labour Party, then he would have finished it, which is the kind of thing we need to hand over to Niall Ferguson to write some counterfactual history on to see what the view of that will be. But there's a certain element of truth in that. But the national treasure thing. Incidentally, Judd Adams was quite entertained with that. Just finish on this. He recalls that a theatre impresario in Swindon was surveying his rather empty theatre on a rainy Wednesday night, and he said, "Who could we get in that will pack them in here in Swindon at this, in the midweek when it's raining. And he said, I know, Tony Benn. And the reason I know that is because he's already done it. He's got Wednesday evening in Swindon when it was raining, reading from his diaries, packed house. And you think, well, people don't know Swindon, what a place. Anyway, I think with that mention of Swindon, I think thanks for those that. Can you just stick your name in the register? And we do have one final meeting, which is in 2 weeks' time, which is the launch of a new book, which probably would have interested Mr. Benn on the antecedents of the revolutionary left, which is all new research by, there's a series of chapters by a range of historians. So that will be an interesting occasion, and I think there'll be some wine as well. Although not provided by me.
Oh, I don't have an email, I'll go to our computer.
It's all right.
A friend of mine has registered me up.
You don't need to have
He
emails.
does my emails for me, it's good.
Yeah, well, I wish I could do that. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.